Anatomically, a reference we can really use to encourage, for example, say the idea of kind of good rib cage and kind of good pelvis control and swing really goes back to that concept often we first became very familiar with, of the idea of kind of core stability in those early 2000s. There certainly is much more realistic approaches. The core, as it's often referred to, isn't that kind of idea of active through the abs and kind of tensing through the abs or bracing through the abs. It was often referred to in those kind of early days in those early 2000s. The core goes into the neck, into the scapula, all parts of the spine, into the pelvis, into the foot and ankle, the arch of the foot, even into our fingers. So we are this kind of huge core movement, not these kind of localized, fix the abs, sit on kind of Swiss balls in a very playful way. The core is the arch of the foot, the scapular connection, the shape of the neck, the jaw, the things that have a global kind of almost complete kind of global system. However, looking more locally at how we can improve that lovely connection between, say, for example, the kind of rib cage and pelvis that produces rotation. It's kind of using the idea of the kind of diaphragm, that our breathing muscle, which kind of sits at the front as our rib cage opens up, almost set into our kind of belly button and a kind of loose definition. So really that localized concept of, in that very kind of informal, fun definition of core stability, really was more how the diaphragm remains connected to the kind of pelvic floor, the deep abs, multifidus, transverse abdominis, for example. So those kind of deep abdominal muscles that locally then control and support the lumbar spine and pelvis. Really, how well those kind of two systems, the diaphragm and our pelvic floor, remain connected in the swing. So loosely speaking, a reference we can use, and this is very much done through our own perception. It's your perception of, your almost representation of at address whatever distance you observe between the diaphragm and the belly button. So kind of using the two fingers, if I turn silent to the camera here, you can see that line on screen now. Whatever distance you perceive between the kind of diaphragm and that kind of belly button, as we move through backswing, is keeping that space the same as we rotate through backswing. Often what we can see when we kind of disconnect almost the core is we're keeping that kind of very fun definition, or we lift the rib cage off the pelvis, is that space increases through backswing. And that can create some very problematic responses through the spine, compression through the lumbar spine, excessive extension kind of through that all parts of the spine, the neck, the cervical spine, the rib cage, the thoracic spine, into that lumbar spine, above the pelvis. Lots of shearing through that lumbar spine. The muscular systems used, we get very active through the paraspinals, the erector spinal muscles. We don't then start to use things like serratus, multifidus, the oblique systems, those lovely rotational systems that we have in the glutes, for example. So often what we then start to see is when that rib cage, pelvis floor, diaphragm, the pelvic floor increases through backswing, can create some very unpleasant, very almost problematic responses then through the whole system. And just to kind of caveat that, there's a tremendous difference to laterally flexing the spine, to extending that rib cage up, to actually creating length and expansion through that trail side. So anatomically, what we're trying to encourage is, as we produce rotation through backswing, we're trying to expand and lengthen that trail side without excessively lateral flexion or extending. We can still absolutely produce that while still keeping that kind of pelvic floor diaphragm connected. So again, we can still get tremendous length through that trail side, but the distance between that kind of rib cage and the pelvis, the diaphragm and pelvic floor remain the same. So one very much to play with and explore. Again, it's almost a question to ourselves. Let's start to then play with, what's my perception, what's my awareness of keeping that space between diaphragm and belly button the same, as I get that lovely kind of expansion and length into that kind of trail side, the pressures of that trail foot, the pressures of that trail hip, the connections of that trail shoulder, the length into that kind of trail side of that kind of spine and rib cage, but while still keeping that kind of pelvis, rib cage, lumbar spine, rib cage, belly button distance, the diaphragm the same through backswing. And this can be a wonderful way of both encouraging good spine movement, good connections to the foot, into the hip, into the shoulder, length into that spine, but then being very mindful and in some ways kind of very respectful of the systems that produce rotation. Serratus, the obliques, the kind of trapezius, in some ways the glutes, without then compressing and shearing through areas such as the low back into that spine, which often we start to see when that diaphragm lifts off the pelvic floor, we disconnect, we lose core stability, as it was referred to now close to 25 years ago, but then start to get compression shears through that lumbar spine, we lift up through often that kind of rib cage. So that lovely playful reference, whatever distance you perceive between the diaphragm and the belly button, is maintaining that distance the same as we move through backswing. Could be a hugely helpful and an advantageous way of encouraging good spine movement and good spine control.